just walked out of the hospital after signing my mother's discharge papers when I got the call that changed everything. My husband had transferred our entire joint savings account into his mother's name while I was sitting in a waiting room praying my mom would survive surgery. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever been blindsided by someone you trusted completely, stay with me, because what happened next took me almost a year to untangle, and I'm still a little stunned I came out the other side of it. My name is Celeste. I was 29 years old. I'd been married for 3 years to a man I genuinely loved, or at least loved the version of him I thought I knew. I worked as a cybersecurity analyst for a mid-sized financial firm in Atlanta. Not glamorous, not a title that turns heads at dinner parties, but I was good at it, and I understood better than most people how fast digital footprints pile up whether you want them to or not. My mother had a cardiac event in the middle of a Tuesday morning. No warning, no build-up, nothing. She was making coffee and then she was on the floor. My brother called me from the ER at 7:42 a.m., and I left my laptop open on my desk, grabbed my keys, and drove 90 miles in under an hour. I sat in that hospital for 11 hours. My husband texted me twice, both times to ask if I'd started the dishwasher before I left. I don't think I fully processed that at the time. I was too focused on my mother. She made it through. Blocked artery, emergency stent, a full week in the cardiac unit before they cleared her to go home. I was at that hospital every single day. My husband visited once for about 45 minutes and spent most of it complaining about the parking garage. On the day I finally got my mother home and settled into her house, I stopped at the ATM to pull out some cash so I could stock her fridge. The machine spat out a little white slip. I stared at it for a long moment in the parking lot of a Kroger, standing in the cold convinced I was misreading it. The account had $63 in it. We had over $47,000 in that account 4 days earlier. I had checked it from the hospital waiting room the same morning my mother was in surgery, because I'd been anxious and clicking through my phone like a nervous habit. 47,200 and some change. I remembered it exactly because I'd thought to myself, okay, at least if something goes wrong with the insurance, we have a cushion. $63. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could move. I went through every rational explanation I could think of. A banking error, a hold, fraud from an outside party, something that had a clean, fixable explanation. Then I called the bank's customer service line and asked them to walk me through the recent transactions on the account. A single wire transfer, 4 days ago, to an account not linked to our profile. They gave me the last 4 digits. I didn't recognize them, but I wrote them down on the back of a receipt I found in my cup holder. Then I drove to my mother's house, put her groceries away, made sure she had her medications lined up in the right order, and told her I had to get home. She could tell something was wrong. She asked me 3 times if I was okay. I said yes every time. I was not okay. When I got home, my husband was on the couch watching a game. He looked relaxed. He looked entirely relaxed. I stood in the doorway for a second longer than he noticed, just looking at him. Then I walked in, set my bag down, and said I needed to check something on the laptop. I'm a cybersecurity analyst. I spend my days monitoring network traffic, flagging anomalies, tracing access points. My husband knew in a general sense what I did for work. What he did not know, because it had never come up the way it was about to come up, was that I had a habit of setting up passive monitoring on our home network as a form of practice, not to spy on him. It genuinely started as professional habit. But our home router logged every device, every connection, every site, every timestamp. I had 3 months of data sitting in a folder I hadn't opened since I set it up. I opened it that night while he was asleep. The wire transfer had been initiated from his phone, from our home network, at 11:17 a.m. on the morning my mother was in surgery. While I was sitting in a plastic chair outside a cardiac unit asking a nurse every 20 minutes if there was any news, he was sitting in our kitchen transferring $47,000. The receiving account was registered to his mother. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark for a long time. Here's the thing about finding out something like that. Your first instinct isn't rage. It's this eerie, suspended disbelief, like your brain is buffering. It can't load the new information fast enough to match it against everything you already know about the person. 3 years of a life. A wedding. A lease. A shared toothbrush holder. Your brain keeps trying to reconcile the data and coming back with an error message. I did not confront him that night. I know that sounds strange, but I'd spent enough time in my professional life watching people react badly when they knew they were caught. Panic makes people do unpredictable things, and I had no idea yet how deep this went or what the full shape of it was. So I went to bed, lay there next to him staring at the ceiling, and started thinking through what I needed to do first. The next morning, I got up early and called in sick to work. Then I called a friend who worked in family law, not to file anything, just to understand what the legal landscape looked like if a spouse transferred marital funds without the other person's knowledge or consent. She told me it was potentially actionable as dissipation of marital assets. She told me to document everything and not to move any money myself until I knew what I was doing. I documented everything. I pulled the full router logs. I pulled his phone's sync history from the shared family account we used for app subscriptions, which he'd forgotten was linked to my email. I found 3 calls to his mother in the 48 hours before the transfer, 2 of which were over an hour long. I found a text thread between them that he hadn't bothered to delete from a tablet we shared because he didn't think I ever used it, because I'd never mentioned using it. I used it sometimes to read at night when my phone was charging across the room. I read through 2 weeks of messages. I had to put the tablet down twice and walk around the apartment just to breathe. His mother had been pushing for this for months. I found the thread going back to February, nearly 8 months. She didn't like me. I'd always known she didn't like me, in the vague ambient way you know a plant isn't getting enough sunlight. Little digs at holidays. A particular way she had of talking to me that was technically polite but left you feeling like you'd said something wrong even when you hadn't. I'd chalked it up to personality difference. I'd been wrong. In the texts, she called me calculating. She said I'd trapped her son. She said I was focused on his income and not on him. She told him multiple times that he needed to protect himself financially. That word, protect, kept appearing over and over. They talked about the savings account specifically. She said if something ever happened to the marriage, that money needed to be somewhere safe, meaning somewhere I couldn't access it. He agreed. In writing. With emoji. I closed the tablet and put it back exactly where I'd found it. There was one more message near the bottom of the thread that I read 4 times to make sure I understood it correctly. His mother said she'd spoken to someone at her bank about the best way to structure things. She said that if my name wasn't on the receiving account, the transfer would be harder to reverse. She said he should wait for a moment when I was distracted. She used the phrase, good window. My mother's surgery was their good window. I sat with that for a while. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn over something hot. Carefully, making sure you understand exactly what you're holding before you decide what to do with it. They had watched and waited for the moment I would be the most distracted, the most vulnerable, the most likely to be too consumed by grief and fear to check a bank account. And they'd taken it. That was the moment my hands stopped shaking. Something in me went very still. I called my attorney friend again and we had a longer conversation. She walked me through my options in detail. Then, I asked her a question she wasn't expecting. I asked her whether, if I could document that the transfer was coordinated in advance, timed deliberately to coincide with a family medical emergency, and executed with the intention of concealing it from me, whether that would change the legal weight of the situation. She was quiet for a second. Then she said yes, it would. I spent the next 4 days being completely normal. I know that sounds difficult. It was the hardest acting job of my life. I made dinner. I asked him about his day. I watched television next to him on the couch. I did not mention the bank account. I did not mention the bank account. I did not mention his mother. I did not mention the texts. I smiled. I passed the salt. I was so ordinary that I started to wonder if he'd actually notice, if some part of him was waiting for me to explode so he could frame my reaction as the problem. On the third evening, his mother called him while I was in the kitchen. I could hear his side of the conversation from where I was standing. His tone shifted into something warmer and looser than he ever used with me anymore. He laughed twice. He said, I know, I know. He said, she doesn't suspect anything. I turned the stove down and stood very still. He said the money was safe. He said once things settled down, they could figure out the next steps. He said something about a property she'd been looking at. I went back to stirring the pasta. That night while he was in the shower, I pulled the tablet again and opened the thread. There were new messages. His mother was asking about timing. She said the longer the money sat in her account, the harder it would be to dispute, especially if I didn't notice for a few more weeks. She said she had a real estate attorney she trusted. She was going to use the money as a down payment on a property. She said it would go into an LLC with her name and my husband's name on it, and once that was done, it would be nearly impossible for me to claim any interest in it. I photographed every message on the tablet with my work phone, which had encrypted storage. Then I closed the app, put the tablet back, and went to brush my teeth. The next morning, I called in sick again. I drove to my attorney friend's office in person, and I put a printed folder on her desk. The folder contained the router logs with timestamps, the bank wire confirmation pulled from our shared account portal, the screenshots of 2 months of text messages, and a one-page written summary I'd typed up the night before, organizing everything in chronological order. She flipped through it slowly. She looked up at me once about halfway through and I just waited. When she finished, she set it down and folded her hands on top of it and said, "Celeste, this is textbook dissipation of marital assets, and the coordination piece, the timing, the real estate plan, the LLC structure, that elevates it. We can go after the full amount plus legal fees, and depending on how the judge reads the intent, potentially more." I asked her what I needed to do next. She told me. I went home and acted normal for 4 more days. On a Friday evening, while my husband was at a friend's house watching a game, I packed a bag. I took my personal documents, my work equipment, the tablet, the router, and the printed folder. I called my brother and asked if I could stay with him for a while. He didn't ask questions. He just said yes. I was out of that apartment in under 2 hours. I filed the paperwork that Monday morning. The legal process took 9 months. I won't describe all of it because a lot of it was just grinding procedural work, the kind of thing that looks boring from the outside but feels like standing in a slow-moving river that's trying to knock you over. But there are a few moments worth telling. The first was when my husband's attorney received the router logs. I was told later, through my own attorney, that his response upon seeing the timestamp on the wire transfer, cross-referenced with the timestamp on my mother's surgical record, was to sit back in his chair and not say anything for almost a minute. The second was when his mother's attorney tried to argue that the money was a loan my husband had made to her voluntarily, that it was unrelated to any marital dispute, and that it had already been partially invested in a business asset that couldn't be easily liquidated. My attorney put the text messages on the table, specifically the message where his mother used the phrase "good window," specifically the follow-up message where she laid out the LLC plan in detail, including the name of her real estate attorney. The other attorney asked for a short recess. The third moment was in the mediation session, which his team had requested because they could see where a full court hearing was going. His mother attended. I had not seen her since Christmas. She sat across a conference table from me in a blazer and pearl earrings, looking like she prepared carefully for how she wanted to appear. She looked at me the same way she always had, like I was a problem that hadn't been fully solved yet. I looked back at her and thought about that text message, "good window." She'd waited for the moment I was most afraid for my mother's life, and she'd called it a good window. I smiled at her, not warmly. The kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near your eyes. She looked away first. The mediation resulted in a full return of the $47,000, plus interest calculated from the date of transfer, plus a portion of my legal fees. The LLC his mother had been building was dissolved before it was ever fully registered. The real estate deal fell through. I was told she'd already put a deposit down that she lost. As for my husband, we finalized the divorce 7 months later. He did not contest most of it by the end. I think once the texts became part of the formal record, he understood that the story he planned to tell about our marriage, the one where I was the cold, calculating one, didn't hold up against 2 months of documented evidence that the calculation had been entirely on his side. He moved back in with his mother. I heard from a mutual friend that they're not getting along. In the year since, I've moved to a smaller apartment that's completely mine, with my name on the lease and nothing else tangled up in anyone else's choices. I got a significant promotion at work. My mother is doing well. She walks 2 miles every morning now, which she never did before the cardiac event. And she calls me every few days just to check in. There's something I've thought about a lot in the time since all of this happened. Not the legal strategy, not the documentation, but the moment in the hospital parking lot when I was standing there holding that little white ATM slip. I had two options in that moment: fall apart or get very quiet and very focused. I chose to get quiet. People who try to exploit your worst moments are counting on the chaos of those moments. They're counting on you being too exhausted, too scared, too heartbroken to look closely at what they're doing. They pick the window on purpose. The only thing that took that power away from them was refusing to perform the panic they were expecting. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I documented. I planned. I waited. And when I finally moved, I moved once, completely, and it was over. If someone in your life has ever tried to use your hardest moment as their opportunity, you already know this feeling. The weird cold clarity that comes when grief and fury stop competing with each other and just merge into something sharp and still. Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And subscribe to Recovery Stories because we're just getting started. I still think about that ATM slip sometimes. Just a little white rectangle. The kind you shove in your pocket without looking at. But I stood there in a Kroger parking lot in the cold, holding it with both hands, and I remember thinking, this is the clearest thing I'd seen in 3 years. That sounds dramatic, but betrayal has a way of sharpening your vision. What my husband and his mother did wasn't just about money. $47,000 is real, and losing it mattered. But the thing that took me longer to name was the specific cruelty of the timing. They didn't just take from me, they chose the moment I was most afraid, most open, most distracted by love for someone else, and they called it an opportunity. That's not a financial decision. That's a character decision. And once I understood that, I stopped being confused about what kind of people they were. I've thought a lot about what got me through it. Not the legal outcome, not the mediation, but the part before any of that. The part where I had to decide, alone in the dark, what kind of person I was going to be in response to what they'd done. The first thing that saved me was honesty. Not the dramatic kind, not confronting anyone or forcing a confession. Just being ruthlessly honest with myself about what I was looking at. I could have talked myself into another explanation. I almost did. There's a pull toward the comfortable version of reality when the true version is that painful. But I'd built a whole career around looking at data without flinching. And I applied that same standard to my own life. Whatever I found, I was going to see it clearly. That kind of moral honesty, the willingness to face a hard truth even when every instinct says to look away, is what made everything else possible. The second thing was using my head when my heart wanted to take over. I was furious. I was heartbroken. I was still dealing with my mother's recovery while simultaneously realizing my marriage was a structure built on sand. The urge to walk in and explode was real, but I'd seen enough at work to know that panic hands control to the people who planned against you. So I got quiet. I documented. I thought 3 steps ahead. People who exploit your worst moments are counting on the chaos of those moments to keep you from thinking straight. The moment I decided to think instead of react, the balance of power shifted entirely without them realizing it. The third thing, and this one I underestimated, was just not stopping. There were days in that 9-month legal process where I was exhausted and angry, and I wanted it to be over in whatever way made it end fastest. But I kept going, not of spite, though I won't pretend spite wasn't somewhere in the mix, out of something quieter than that. A sense that I owed it to myself to see it through, that I'd already done the hard part, the seeing clearly part, the thinking carefully part, and that walking away before the finish line would have made all of that mean nothing. Celeste came out the other side of it. My mother walks 2 miles every morning now. I have an apartment with my name on the lease and nothing else tangled up in anyone else's decisions. The window they picked turned out to be mine.